and studying about this for quite a while. He's the Regents Professor and Faculty Director of the Center of Law, Science and Innovation at Arizona State University and the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law of Arizona State University. Gary is the world's expert. And in fact, we read a lot of his paper when we formed the CESTI to think about how do we approach this issue. So we asked him here to tell us from his point of view, this whole issue and how relevant it is and what do we need to do about this. So Gary, thank you very much for being our keynote speaker. I would like to ask you now, if you wish to give your remarks.
Great, thank you very much, Dr. Dazo, and I'm delighted to be here because I think this is a tremendous and challenging undertaking the National Academy of Medicine is on, and I congratulate you for trying to address this issue of governing these emerging medical technologies. And I want to, in just 15 minutes, sort of give a little snapshot of some of the lessons we've learned from the past of trying to govern these and other technologies. So we have a lot of emerging technologies in the healthcare world right now. This is a list, I'm sure it's partial, there's probably others as well. But it really is an extraordinary time that we have so many of these different technologies all moving into society at the same time period. Most of these were science fiction just a couple of decades ago, and then they've gone through research, and now many of them are now moving into commercialization or clinical applications, and they all provide significant benefits. That's why they're moving forward. But I think every one of them also presents some concerns or risks. And to be able to effectively manage those risks will be critical in order to enjoy the benefits of these technologies. So the challenge is, with this whole proliferation of different healthcare technologies in the world today, how can we use some kind of governance framework to try to manage the concerns and risks of these and promote the benefits, as speakers already today have emphasized is sort of the goal of this whole exercise. So when we try to govern these emerging technologies, there's a number of challenges that make it particularly difficult for our traditional regulatory administrative law systems to function effectively. One is the rapid pace of development, how fast these technologies are emerging. The second is uncertainty. Everything has uncertainty, but these are really prevalent and major uncertainties often about the trajectories and the benefits and risks of these technologies, in large part because of how fast they're coming into society. And as the article in the New England Journal of Medicine talked about this week, that they basically, these technologies often go out of their lane. When I was a regulatory lawyer, each thing we regulated was a specific agency in a specific industry sector. Many of these technologies are technologies that go across many different industries, many different sectors, many different regulatory agency jurisdictions, which makes it very hard then to coordinate governance. Many of these present concerns that go beyond, they include the traditional things like health and safety and environmental risks are often very important. But there's often many other concerns that go beyond that are outside the jurisdiction of agencies. And then we have a growing public concern about a lot of these technologies, but at the same time, information asymmetries where much of the public is not aware of a lot of the background of these technologies sort of sprung upon them suddenly. They see something on social media or on the TV or in fiction about them and have concerns. And then all of these have a significant international component. These are all being developed simultaneously across many different jurisdictions. So just going into some of these in a little bit more detail, the timing issue I think is really unique and really challenges traditional regulation. So these technologies, both the science and technology, sort of go hand in hand and are developing at a really unprecedented pace in the last couple decades. I actually think ethics does a pretty good job of keeping up with it. I think ethicists are increasingly aware and attuned to what's going on in the science and technology community. I think they understand the importance of that. And you see ethicists often very quickly responding to new scientific developments or technological developments fairly quickly and effectively. The easy thing about ethics and the challenge of it, though, is that they can just put out a report or an article or whatever. They don't have to actually implement a solution. I'm sure they'd like to, but that's not their job. Their job is to call attention to the trade-offs and the concerns and the issues and so on. And I actually think we're quite effective, our ethicists are quite effective at basically bringing attention to some of the concerns these technologies raise. I think where we really fall down, though, is doing something about it. And that comes to the legal sector of putting in place regulations or statutes to control these. And that's where I think we really lag. At the risk of telling my own work, we published a couple of volumes on an NSF-funded study called The Pacing Problem a decade ago. And in the first book here, we basically document the problem where we show that technology and science are speeding up. They're getting to the market much faster than traditionally. They're getting into consumers' hands much faster than traditionally, but our regulatory system at the same time is actually slowing down. We're becoming increasingly bureaucratic, increasingly difficult to get through either legislation or regulation that often take decades to adopt. And then once they are in place, they often will stay in place for decades, even though they're clearly out of date. So we have this problem of outdated regulations and legislation, and other problems that the legislation and regulation just isn't there for years or decades. And that this problem is actually getting worse over time. And so the rest of this volume and the next volume would trying to look at solutions to that. And so this is sort of just a cartoon, sort of, I think, characterizing sort of the problem we're in. You know, these two kids laying on the ground and saying, geez, that cloud looks like a falling engine. It could be a falling engine, or it could be a cloud, who knows? But this is the problem, is that we're sort of paralyzed often to take action on what these ethicists are bringing our attention to of concerns, and yet we don't really have effective means to move quickly enough to keep up with the science and technology, and not to freeze the science and technologies by putting in place rigid rules and regulations that quickly become outdated. Another issue is the regulatory mismatch. So our main agency for regulating emerging technologies, the FDA, I actually think they do a pretty good job, and they try to be proactive and try to look at a lot of these things coming, but statutorily, they're basically restricted primarily to looking at the efficacy and the safety of these products or technologies as they're coming into commerce. And yet we know there's a lot of other concerns that ethicists raise, that the public has, policymakers raise, that are really outside of the FDA's jurisdiction and expertise. And yet these are important issues that the public feels a lot of concern about, that are important. And so we need to have some mechanism for these things to be taken account of. We could expand the FDA's jurisdiction, but that can be problematic. We want our government agencies making ethical declarations, particularly when these overlap with religious concerns, for example, which again are legitimate factors, but we want a government agency determining, you know, from a religious perspective, what this technology should be allowed to do or not. So it's problematic of how do we consider these important factors and not just disregard them, but how do we structure that so that can happen? Another issue is the international component. Again, all these technologies are being developed in the sort of same time frame by various different jurisdictions all around the world. And there's all kinds of synergies, but also competition between countries and so on of how these technologies are going to develop. And so we have to, I think, be aware of this international dimension. And with a colleague, Brad Allenby, we'd identified 10 different reasons why some kind of international governance may be appropriate. And these apply differently to different technologies. No technology is probably going to hit all 10 of those. Maybe some only hit one, some 2 or 3. But there's these different reasons why we might want international coordination or harmonization or whatever. And so the question is, what is it about this particular technology that makes the international dimension important? And then once you understand the reasons that this is important internationally, that might help to figure out how's the best way to try to address those. In the report that Alta co-chaired on human genome editing, we have a table in there of sort of 3 main categories of trying to address international coordination. The historical way people have addressed international concerns is with a treaty. But treaties are very difficult. They involve just a tremendous amount of effort and resources by countries. They don't always work. They don't always be complied with. Just consider climate change, for example. We spent 30 years now, and I don't know how many thousands and thousands of airplane rides, emitting carbon to try to come up with a CO2 global warming treaty that's addressing a very clear and critical problem for everybody in the world. And yet, what we ended up with is a treaty where each country just said, well, do what we want. Not to disparage that. There's a great report yesterday in Nature just came out saying if people live up to those promises, it could have a major effect. And so hopefully all those airplane rides are going to pay off with a solution, but it's an enormous investment of resources. And we're just not going to be able to do that for most technologies. And so treaties, a lot of international scholars refer to it as treaty fatigue. Treaties are sort of on the out as as an effective international mechanism of governance, except for the most extreme problems. And so we have to look at other tools and other methods. One is these non-binding type of tools, such as guidelines or principles and standards from professional organizations or other entities, which have the advantage of not being tied to a specific jurisdiction. So they're inherently international in scope and application. And an example is that several people on this call have been very instrumental in is the ISSCR guidelines for embryonic stem cell research would be an example of an effective guideline. And then interesting, just having regulators and policymakers being able to talk and coordinate with each other turns out to be an extremely important mechanism for international governance. We did a study once sponsored by the government of Canada to interview government policymakers, scientists, industry groups, NGO groups on different mechanisms for international coordination. And we were surprised that the number one response among all four sectors was this ability for government people in different areas to know their colleagues in other countries, that they could just call them up and talk to them and say, how are you addressing this problem, or meet with them once a year. These sort of informal interactions turn out to be incredibly powerful ways of trying to promote international coordination. So it's not just treaties for international governance, there's all these other tools that are possibly available. And then finally, the public is a key part of this. And you have a session coming up later today on public engagement, absolutely critical. National Academy and other studies have showed it's absolutely critical, but it's very difficult. And one of the reasons it's difficult is because the public, as human beings, we're risk averse, we're change averse. We don't like new things. And so as Isaac Asimov said, I discovered to my amazement that all through history, there's been resistance and bitter, exaggerated, last-ditch resistance to every single technological change that's taken place on Earth. Celeste's Kuma's recent book on innovation as enemies talks about, every technology we've had has encountered tremendous resistance, refrigeration, electricity, coffee, even though we later, require that technology. Others, though, we legitimately reject. And so how do we tease out what is the sort of just a knee-jerk reaction we all have to new technologies? I actually just chaired a National Academy Committee on greenhouse gas emissions where we have a whole section on innovation resistance to electric vehicles. People have a resistance to this thing that gets them out of their comfort zone, that changes how they do things. And so they are unduly cautious about moving to new technologies. And yet when they do, they often will tend to like it. I just bought my first electric vehicle. I love it, but I resisted for years. And then once you make that jump, you suddenly say, hey, why didn't I like this earlier? So that's going to be the case. We've seen it for a lot of medical technologies. Blood transfusions at the beginning of the 20th century were very controversial. Vaccines are controversial. IVF was very controversial and now are generally accepted. Other ones, of course, stay and maybe even increase their objections from the public. So when you do public engagement, do you take account of this risk adversity, this change adversity of human nature, and not suppress technologies, but on the other hand, truly give credence to legitimate concerns the public has. So in trying to address these problems, we have a number of ways to do this. So one is to expand the circle of who's involved in governance. That traditionally it's been the government unilaterally telling people what to do, telling companies what to do. Government continues to have a critical role in governance, obviously, but we need to expand it to include other entities to also have a role. Various types of experts in science and ethics and public policy, law even, industry groups, NGO groups, think tanks, insurers, auditing groups, all need to have a place at the table, not only to comment on it, but to actually help develop the tools and help to oversee the implementation of them. And then we need to move from just using these traditional command and control regulations adopted by government agencies to include a variety of other tools that are sometimes called soft law, that include these various types of instruments that can be also an important part of governance. And the idea is sort of these 3 A's of trying to develop governance systems that are anticipatory, that try to anticipate the problems before they occur and try to prevent them, some kind of precaution in anticipating the technologies. But as the article published in the New England Journal talks about this week, the Collins Ridge dilemma, that we often don't know what those are until they happen. So we also have to be adaptive, that even if we try to do a good job up front, we're going to miss things, and we have to be able to respond to those and have a system that can adapt, and in doing so has to be agile and be able to move very quickly, much faster than sometimes government agencies can. So I would say government doesn't get an A in any of these A's, they all B's or C's. And so that's a problem of this problem of being anticipatory, adaptive, and agile. And when we look more broadly, you can sort of see 4 really governance frameworks that often are argued against each other, but to me, they all have a role to play, and there's a lot of synergies. Some of these will have a greater role in some cases than others, but it includes these soft law mechanisms I was just talking about. It includes responsible research, which is an idea that really developed in Europe initially, but has some increasing saliency here in the United States as well, of basically when you're developing these technologies and how you steer it and how you design it and how you anticipate it to be used in productive and ethical ways as opposed to unproductive or unsafe ways. Something that is really just a growing recognition is this idea of resilience, of being able to design systems to be able to respond and to be able to bounce back if things do go wrong, because inevitably some things will go wrong. And so we can't just try to prevent them. We also have to try to be ready to respond to them. And then, of course, liability can also play a critical role as a governance tool. So these are 4 different spheres of governance, all of which have some relevance in these emerging technologies. But of course, these soft law and other mechanisms have their limitations. The 2 most or 3 most important might be accountability. If they're just voluntary, how do we know companies will actually comply with these, or laboratories? Maybe they'll just say they are, they'll greenwash or ethics wash what they're doing. So that's a huge legitimate issue. The credibility of these systems, does the public trust in them, and should they? And then participation is a huge issue, because, as much as you can criticize governments as just really responding to certain elite groups in society, everybody at least has a right to participate in government governance, whereas that's not the case in some of these soft laws. It's like someone is deciding who's at the table and who isn't. So how do we ensure that that's accountable and responsible to the various sectors of society who have an interest in this outcome? And so these are real serious limitations of these soft law programs. Because of that, we recently have undertaken a study to try to figure out, what makes soft law work and what doesn't. We commissioned, for example, 4 studies. This is all available open source now on the internet, of environmental areas, of nanotech, of information communication technologies, and life sciences, and sort of 4 major areas that have had decades of experience in dealing with soft law. And so we commissioned these studies to look at some examples in these areas, and did it work or did it not? And more importantly, why did it work or why did it not? And we found that actually probably more often than not, they did not work, or they had a mixed success. Sometimes they had more success, but the factors that really drove success we found were pretty clear. There are things like having a regulatory backup. If there is a threat of government regulation, if you cannot come up with a better solution on your own, had a tremendous impact in some cases to influence private actors to do responsible things. Insurers had a big interest in this, to require certain types of risk management programs to be put in place as a condition of getting liability insurance. Preventing liability. Liability can be a huge crusher of companies. You can see major companies going bankrupt because of liability. So I think more and more companies are recognizing, particularly with the punitive damage systems we have in the United States, to punish companies who act in a really egregious way and an insensitive way, that they have to be on top of this, or their whole company could go under. Contractual requirements through supply agreements and so on to require certain compliance with certain types of ethical and risk management systems. And then the public can play a critical role in different situations, more effective than others. And then, so incentives are key mechanisms. Is the C-suite engaged in this? Turns out to be very critical for company voluntary programs. Having an external ethics committee that can provide an independent advice and recommendations. Having a partner of a company with an NGO who will sort of hold it accountable and be able to look at what it's doing. And then the FTC enforcement could be very effective because they can enforce and have enforced against companies who basically say they're going to do one thing and then don't. Even though FTC may not have direct jurisdiction over them, they do have jurisdiction over deceptive or unfair business practices and have concluded that if a company says it's going to do something and it turns around and doesn't, then that would be a reason for enforcement. So there is an indirect government tool. So a lot of the area I'm working on right now, and I think is really important, is to think of when we're going to rely more on these soft law tools, which I think is inevitably we have to, which doesn't mean we don't need government regulation. There's a role for government regulation too, but there's also a role for the soft law. We have to find ways to make it more credible and effective. Often we just sort of adopt the substantive expectations we expect the players to do with no real follow-up or oversight to make sure they're actually doing this. And I think there are a number of tools available from some of these case studies in the past and looking forward where we can use a suite of different mechanisms to try to ensure these soft law mechanisms are actually being implemented and followed and sort of indirectly enforced at least. So I think this is a really important area going forward, is to think of procedurally, how do we ensure these soft law non-enforceable mechanisms are actually complied with? And I'll just conclude with this quote, paraphrasing Winston Churchill: soft law is the worst form of governance, except for all the others. He, of course, said that about and with that, if we have time for questions, I'd be happy to consider that, respond.
So thank you very much, Gary, for really setting the stage framing for the rest of the meeting. These are exactly the issues that the committee CESTI has considered. And in coming to, I guess in your ways, all these are different tools. The question is, how do we bring these tools together? And what's a legitimate coordinated body that can actually use the tools to guide the development of technology? I think that's really the big issue, right? At the end of the day, if there's a single place you can go to and to say, did you meet all those issues, including soft laws and the toolbox? You know, that's the way to go for it. But I think our challenge has always been, well, then who is it that would do this? So could you expand on that thinking a little bit?
Sure, and I think it is a core key question because, you know, traditionally we rely on government and government is, legitimately constituted. You know, we have a constitution, we create these agencies, they're required to go through these democratic processes, whether it's in Congress where they vote on it, or a regulatory agency is delegated this authority by Congress and has to go through a public rulemaking. So we put in place these very elaborate and effective systems for accountability. Now, of course, we have all kinds of problems with our Congress and with our regulatory agencies being mired down in polarization and all these things. But still, we have that core accountability that's absolutely fundamental for a democratic society. So now, if we're going to look at other players, we don't have that same centralized, established accountability. And that is a major limitation. The answer, I think, is that it's not one entity. It's the community. It's all these different groups have to participate, from experts to industry to think tanks to non-governmental organizations and advocacy organizations. They all have to have a role and a voice and a place at the table. And collectively, I think they can create the accountability that would be required, maybe never as great as government, but at least some accountability to allow us to have some trust and some faith in these governance tools that can be much more adaptive. That, there's no sense of, just having this great accountable government system that sits there for 20 years unable to regulate or unable to adopt a statute. Our study found that the only time we can really move off the dime often with Congress at least is a crisis or a disaster occurs. And they will move, but they got so many issues on their plate, in this sphere alone, but also, hundreds of other issues, budgetary, war, all these international things going on, COVID, and they're mired down in polarization, that they just aren't able to respond. And so they are part of the solution, but they are not going to be sufficient on their own. And so we need something else. And it has to be sort of a network idea of a complexity of not one sole, designated decider of this, but some coalition or network of different stakeholders.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. And I do think what you're hearing is CESTI has been thinking very much along this way, which we call cross-sectoral, right? Coordinated. And then, of course, the committee consensus that will make formal recommendations on how to move forward. I'd like to bring up two other things very quickly and certainly open for anyone who's got questions. I think you talk about incentive. It turns out that is so important. Incentive and expectations. So if you look at corporations, now we all talk about ESG, right? So, and then you take climate as an example. There is, in fact, more and more investors saying, I need to invest in responsible companies that have good ESG. So that, in fact, is a way to move that in the same direction. At the same time, SEC recently says, well, we need public disclosure on how you guys are doing. Without talking necessarily about, penalty, whatever. So these are some of the tools that can be useful. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And I think it's a great example and precedent on governance that this has become such a powerful force in boardrooms and in corporations. But of course, we also see strategic behavior, right? So and the interesting thing is, what tools do we have to deal with that? So there's been a whole raft of recent litigation against companies who made false ESG claims of greenwashing, of saying they're doing one thing on one hand and then not doing it. And now they're being sued either by NGOs or by stakeholders or other groups who are saying, we have been injured by relying on your claims that are not legitimate. So it's providing sort of an enforcement mechanism. The FTC just last week brought a claims against enforcement action against two companies for their false green claims that they're saying they're doing all these wonderful sustainability things, but they weren't in reality. So we see example there of two mechanisms on my list of FTC enforcement and liability as indirect enforcers of these claims that are otherwise potentially unregulated. And then, as you say, the SEC is going to play a role here to require this to be publicly available so that people can hold companies their feet to the fire to see that they're actually doing what they say they're doing through transparency. So again, we're going to use these various tools to help move this very effective, potentially effective idea of ESG forward and have a real world impact and not allow it to just be used as sort of window dressing.
So from the audience, this question says, even though government agencies don't get an A+, they are important to protect the public. They're created by act of Congress and they are limited by congressional authority given to them. Any thoughts on this?
Absolutely true. So we just did an interesting study of some 570 something soft law mechanisms in AI. The number one player in soft law mechanisms is government. So government is also a player in soft law because they know some of their traditional tools often are going to be too slow or too burdensome or too awkward to deal with this. I remember having a meeting of all the different agencies involved in nanotechnology and was shocked that they went around the table and each of the 7 agencies said, we absolutely need soft law to govern this technology because we're going to be a decade behind. And so government plays an active role in encouraging and facilitating and sometimes participating in some of these soft law programs, both successful and unsuccessful. So, traditional government regulation will continue to have a role because it is so accountable, but also governments play an important role in these other areas as well, as a coordinating entity, as a facilitating entity, as a participant sometimes. And so they're very much a part of the community that needs to be part of this.
Yeah, thank you. Let me take one other question from the audience. This relates to, smaller companies starting up of new ideas, new technology. How do you navigate all these issues? In other words, if you're a responsible researcher, innovator, entrepreneur, you want to make sure that, in fact, what you do is not only going to benefit public good, but it gets away from any unintended risks, if you will. How do you navigate this?
I think it's one of the hardest problems because unlike some of the big companies that have, well-established risk management groups, legal departments, and other, systems in place to try to, not lose the company to inappropriate actions, these smaller companies are much more risky. They may not survive, and they know that, so they're going to be more willing to take risks, more willing to do stuff sort of on the cutting edge. Which is good. I mean, that's sort of the engine of innovation that our country's always developed and benefited from. But on the other hand, they could take inappropriate risks. And so how do you govern those? They're below the radar often, but they are going to take more risks. If they go bankrupt, they go bankrupt. They're probably going to do that anyhow, and they know it. So they want to take the risks if they have to. How do you regulate or control or manage them when they may not have the same incentives? Well, again, they often will have a lot of their own personal money invested in that. So things like insurers, if they do have liability insurance, some of them don't even do that though, can play a role. Larger companies who are suppliers or customers of them can play a role in their value chain risk management systems to ensure that they're following appropriate procedures and precautions. And so media, oversight of what they're doing. So there are some tools available. It is a much bigger challenge actually for these very small fly below the radar companies who might be much more likely to take some radical risks and then could, destroy the whole technology. All it takes is one irresponsible little company to do something completely crazy and the whole technology could suffer their reputation as a result. So it is a major challenge and something that hopefully your committee can study as well.
Well, thank you. And I think this will be discussed throughout the 2 days. And I do think an intention of this whole effort is to look at, is there an early look to help these innovations, these small companies say very early, check it out. Therefore, you know your risk, you know your benefit. And if you can, see those things and you set incentive, then you're more likely to succeed than otherwise you may surprise yourself by having the ability to move forward. Thank you very much, Gary. Let me just give you an applause and gets difficult in Zoom, but thank you very much indeed. So we are right on time.